Our next speaker is Lauren, the wonderful Lauren Rickards, and as Lauren said before, she's co-leader of a project on transformations in the urban research area here at RMIT, and she's also, amongst other things, many other things, she's also a lead author on the IPCC covering Australia and New Zealand, the Australia and New Zealand chapter, causing lots of trouble there, and but she's really good. And today she's talking about decarbonisation and recarbonisation. Lauren.
Okay, so we've heard about some of the new research, the new science and information that's coming out, and that's the remit of tonight is to update. I wanted to talk about updating some of the lenses, so some of the ways we're learning to see differently and to think differently, and some of the opportunities as well as some of the risks that this poses. So one of the kind of overarching shifts which I feel like is happening in society is that we're starting to think more, what academics would call relationally. We're starting to see things in terms of relationships, links and flows. We're starting to see how connected things are. There's already been good examples of the sorts of flow-on effects and interconnections, and Ronya pointed to some of those already around the kind of interrelationship between where people live, the air they breathe, and the lack of political attention that those particular areas then tend to get as well. So there's all sorts of interrelationships that climate change is helping to reveal. I want to go through 4 of them, and there's many more I could have picked as well, but one of the crucial ones is the idea, or the reality, I should say, of understanding the Earth as a system. So understanding the interrelationships between the empty space above land, aka air, atmosphere, between that and water. We heard Mark talk about the way that the ocean is both being affected by the global temperature and also drawing down some of the carbon, as well as the cryosphere, so the ice, which is of course a major player in terms of climate change impacts, the biosphere, everything that's living, the lithosphere, so all of the earth and the rocks and all of the big shifts that are going on there, and understanding that all of these things are far more interconnected than we've appreciated, perhaps even 10 years ago. So there's a rapid learning that's going on to understand just how complex this thing is that we're poking. And part of it is, of course, understanding that we're not outside of it poking, but that we're actually intimately involved in it, both in a sort of really intimate physical sense of breathing the air, breathing the actual, part of the flows that we're talking about, and understanding that in actual fact all living things are part of that as well. And I'm going to talk about microbes in a moment. So we've heard already about the awareness that we now have of the dangers of fossil fuel combustion. Another one of the related awakenings you might like to have is the different types of fire. We heard in one of the questions about the different types of smoke. We're now learning to become connoisseurs of fire and understanding, if you like, that there's kind of unnecessary fire, there's contained fire, the fire of combustion that's so normalised and so out of sight we don't tend to think about it. There's the fire that breaks out into our awareness, the bushfire, and of course within that there's also very important differences, and we're very much aware in Australia of the value of cultural fire, of traditional ways of using fire as well. So we're becoming connoisseurs of fire just as we're becoming connoisseurs of smoke. And part of that is about understanding, as I said, the flows between the different components of the Earth system. And while on the one hand we're more and more aware of the toxic atmosphere, toxic gases that are coming out of fossil fuel combustion and are at the heart of a lot of climate change, we also haven't fully dealt with the dilemma or the conundrum that actually the number one greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, is of course natural, as are key other ones such as methane. This has actually been a stick that climate change skeptics have used to beat the climate change movement on, and it's something that we sort of, I think, recoiled away from, but actually need to intellectually engage with this. And one of the ways we're starting to intellectually engage with it is to understand that we can draw it back down. And we don't actually just have to draw it back down and lock it away like a toxic nuclear waste in the way that carbon capture and storage kind of does, like hide it away and cut it in and put a sign there, don't touch, and hope that the jurisdictions in later decades actually pay attention to that. No, in actual fact, we realise we can draw it down and that can be a benefit. This is one of the co-benefits that we heard about earlier as well. And so this is, of course, the carbon cycle, and understanding that carbon drawdown or terrestrial carbon sequestration, as it's called, actually enriches the soil, it enriches vegetation, and it actually is a positive. And so there's a win-win there. So it's a really useful new lens on the problem that we have a maldistribution of greenhouse gases, and we have a maldistribution particularly of carbon dioxide. There's too much of it in the atmosphere. And arguably there's not enough carbon down in the lithosphere. So we need to draw it back down, back to where most of it used to be, as well as the ocean. But when we do that, we actually then start to realise some of the risks involved in this, because one of the things about cycles is that there's lots and lots of different scales of the cycles going on, lots and lots of different players, lots of different actors. And as I said, one of the things we're aware of now is just how powerful microbes are, and microbes and a whole lot of other living organisms. And they are actually playing a different role into the carbon cycle, a different pace, than some of what the vegetation is playing. So there's dangers here that actually if we over-rely on the idea of carbon drawdown, particularly terrestrial carbon drawdown, we may not fully grasp the complexity of it and the fact that we are going to reach saturation points, and in actual fact it can also be pulsed back up, particularly as it's impacted by climate change effects, including heat, drought, fire, as well as decomposition after floods. So there's a need for us to become really, really sophisticated in understanding the role played by all the different living things in this cycle as we begin to appreciate its role in climate change. The other danger is, of course, that we kind of put all our eggs in one basket and that we actually become too reliant on this. And the whole idea of carbon offset is very much based on this idea that we can keep having the combustion from fossil fuels, whether from a coal-fired power station or whether from an aircraft. We can rely on someone somewhere planting trees. We can feel that that carbon's being drawn down, and we can continue on our merry way. Because of the urgency of the situation we're facing, it's very, very clear that this can be important, but it is far, far from sufficient. And in actual fact, some people would say it's not important, that actually it's a distraction, and that we actually need to focus far more on mitigation, so actually stopping the amount of emissions going up. So we're starting to become more sophisticated in thinking about the carbon cycle and greenhouse gases, but at the same time we also need to become more sophisticated in the dangers of over-relying on these cycles. The second link that I want to draw our attention to is the idea of starting to understand how simplistic our thinking has been around consumption and production. So we're very much part of a kind of linear mode of operating where production happens, usually somewhere else, comes to us here in the city, we consume, and then we chuck out the waste. It's very much part of the idea of the kind of smokestack of society. Of course, that smokestack of society involves a whole lot of different wastes. And it's only when these cycles start to grind to a halt or suddenly screech to a halt that we become much more aware of them, such as the recycling crisis last year. Ongoing, I should say. And so one of the ways that we're starting to tackle not just climate change but a whole host of sustainability issues is starting to try to repair the lost cycle. So in a sense, the carbon cycle is a kind of circular economy, if you like, and we're starting to apply that principle of circular economy thinking into a whole lot of other ways of operating as well. So part of this is about designing up waste and pollution in the first place, so rather than just kind of necessarily utilising the waste that comes out of a fossil fuel stack, actually not producing it in the first place. We're also looking to ways that actually reframe what counts as a waste, which about that in a second. And we're partly also trying to put things in use, get away from that disposable mentality. And I'm sure many of you are key leaders in this area. So one of the things, as I said, one of the kind of reframings that's going on is revaluing what we now consider to be waste products as resources. And perhaps the most controversial or difficult of this is human food, otherwise known as biosolids, human biosolids. And one of the really interesting projects I'm doing at the moment is with a bunch of engineers at RMIT, South East Water, Melbourne Water and other water utilities, which is looking at the biosolids epidemic, biosolids accumulation issue that Melbourne has, as we have urban growth, high populations, less space to actually deal with it in the traditional ways of spreading it out and drying it out. And a whole lot of greenhouse gas emissions coming from that process of sewage management as well. And so one of the processes is how to actually convert it, use it as a fuel. So again, connoisseurs of fire, we're using it as a fuel. We're using a very special type of fire called pyrolysis, where there's no oxygen present, converting it into something called biochar, which then helps to draw down extra carbon from the atmosphere into the soils to which it's applied. So it's kind of a win-win-win type situation. So this is the sort of thinking, these are the sorts of catalytic ideas where you can intervene at very key points in systems that we really need. But of course, again, it comes with dangers, and we must hone our critical thinking skills here as well, because if we're actually using it to justify urban expansion, if we're using it to just justify a greater and greater throughput of biosolids without actually looking at some of the issues around consumption and production, and then from a circular economy perspective, what we've got is circles that just keep expanding, then we're also in trouble. So we need to start thinking in ways of designing it out in the first place as well. Okay, so the third type of flow or link I want to talk about is electrical. We're becoming much, much more attuned to the fact that, for example, in this room, we are, of course, connected to the Latrobe Valley via the electrical flows. That so much of what we do is electrified. And one of the kind of, I guess, great hopes for climate change action is that we actually electrify more things, that we electrify vehicles to try to design our oil use, that we electrify a whole lot of things so that we don't have to move around so much. And RMIT is busy trying to electrify teaching in a kind of online, not Refocus. So that too. But again, one of the ways these flows come to attention is, of course, when they don't work. And we're increasingly aware that electrification and centralisation, yes, they have benefits. We can control the emissions that come out of them far more easily. However, at the same time, if those electrical systems remain connected to fossil fuel sources, if those electrical systems are themselves impacted by climate change impacts, whether that be storms, I don't know if you can type one of those pylons has fallen over, whether it's by heat and overburdening the system, or it's by fires, then we start to see the risks and vulnerabilities that that reliance on our centralised electrical systems plays. And that cue there is in order to get out fuel, petrol, for cars, because the fuel pumps themselves rely on electricity. So these systems are not disconnected. These are the sorts of systemic vulnerabilities that were exposed during the fires, which is one reason I feel like the whole situation was so traumatic for us, because it all just became so apparent how precarious our so-called highly developed existence is. And the final type of flow I want to mention are the financial ones. We've already heard about the role of the divestment movement, and that has become possible because of this really important realisation of the power of money. We've already always known money is important, but usually in that sort of sense of like who's got the bigger pile of coins, gold coins is, the bigger king type way. Whereas actually what we're starting to see is that these are about flows. It's where is the investment directed? And you have to follow some pretty icky dark tunnels to often find these sorts of things. But if by following these flows, we start to see some opportunities. First of all, we see some opportunities for some really quick wins, because we just have to actually divest from a whole lot of perverse subsidies. So we start to see the way that a lot of things that we're protesting against from a kind of logical perspective are simply held up by a lot of financial underpinnings that could be turned off. You could turn off those tax. And we also start to see the way a whole lot of institutions are actually, although they may espouse a whole lot of climate change mitigation messages, and there's a big hypocrisy, so admission coming very soon, nevertheless, through all sorts of investments, whether it's our individual superannuation, whether it's the institutions we work for, etc., are actually doing things that our actual work is working against. These sorts of hypocrisies, these sorts of contradictions are starting to grate. That's why we're seeing amazing new voices coming out, like engineers speaking out against the firms that they're working for. It's about shareholders speaking up, etc. And so these flows and the power that comes from harnessing them are becoming very apparent as well. And the final thing about the financial flow is that it, of course, raises the question of, well, what else would we do with all that money? So we're going to divest from this, divest from that. Where's that money going to go? Well, the three previous flows that I talked about point to some very important answers. One's around land regeneration, thinking about the way in which we can actually help become a whole lot more climate resilient by actually building and repairing soil, land, vegetation, including forests. Resilient infrastructure and systems, including particularly in rural and regional ones, which often feel like they're held together with band-aids. So actually working out how to create systems that don't fall over at the slightest disruption. And of course, renewable energy. But more importantly, I think there's big questions here. Community, health, as we've talked about this evening, and education, which being this university brings to mind as well. And there's a flyer there from one of the sort of catchment management authorities. These are the sorts of groups, these are the sorts of organisations that exist that are both money poor, crying out for investment, and yet poised to make a huge positive difference if only we could redirect some of our financial flows towards them. More broadly, I feel like the number one thing we could do is actually to create a far more robust, active, effective and courageous public service so that we actually start to be able to answer the sorts of questions that we got earlier, which is why aren't people doing things? There's a lot of really good people around who are hamstrung by a whole lot of institutional pressures, none the least of which is things about job insecurity. So if we can somehow try to actually reinforce our public service, I feel like that would be an extremely important systemic intervention we could make. Okay, I'll leave it there.